Welcome back to Brighter Morning with Bo on MCTV and U97.5 FM radio and on Facebook Live. And my name is Bo Tiwari. I'm your host this morning. And we have as our first guest, Dr. Darren Conrad. So let's meet him and talk with him. Morning, Dr. Conrad.
Good morning,
how are you doing? Long time.
I'm doing fine.
Long time I haven't seen you. And we haven't even spoken these last few months, huh? You're so busy.
Just one slight correction. I know one slight correction there is that I'm no longer head department, but I'm still in the economics department. So okay. I only picked up that this morning. I tried to message you, but but it's still been busy nonetheless.
Yes, okay. So you gave up the headship. I didn't realize that. But that tells you how long we have not spoken.
Yeah.
All right. How are you doing? You okay?
I'm doing fine. How are you? Yes.
Good.
Staying safe, observing all the protocols, all the regulations in place.
Yes. But let's talk a little bit about Trinidad and Tobago. What's happening with the economy a year and a half after COVID, in your view? And what are the things that we need to carefully look at if we're going to make our way forward?
I think that by and large, from the data that I see, while we see an uptick, I think our debt to GDP ratio went up from 80% to 85%. So that's a little bit a bit of concern for me, but nonetheless, it is, I think, as a result of all of the different measures that were put in place to sort of get people through this period with the pandemic. And I know a lot of effort by the government has gone into to trying to ease the pressures on some of those who would have lost jobs, some of those who would have been businesses who would have had to close for the period. And of course, some of the other measures that were put in place and the cooperation, of course, of the private sector in terms of some moratoriums that were put in place for people with loans who would have lost their jobs. So I think a lot has been done and we've been able to rally. And I think we're at the point now where, and of course, we cannot, it cannot go unnoticed that a lot of resources went into getting the various vaccines within our borders. So I think that is where, we actually have done quite well in getting it in. So I think that now that we are at the point where we are now that we've rallied that period, what we really need to put our energies and focus into now which is going forward, how to continue to build this sustainable, and I'm glad that you used the word resilient, because not just sustainable, but in the face of climate change, we also need to build an economy that is also resilient. So it is not just sustainable, but resilient is key going forward. So I think by and large, and economically, we're not in a bad space, as bad as it could possibly be. And I think that is based on some of the quick changes that were made, I think is in March 2020, when it was revisited with the Heritage and Stabilization Fund to allow the government to draw down a 1.5 billion in the case of this pandemic to get us through that. So, I think that we've been able to navigate it without going off the edge of the cliff. But I think now we really need to take a hard look at the sustainability and resilience issues.
Okay, the Minister of Finance says that we spent $5 billion on what are basically COVID relief measures. What do you think of that? And can you see the effect of that as an economist? How would you assess the effect of that?
I think the effect of that has been that now there would be some instances where we would hear the stories in the news media, or we would see some pleas in the social media for assistance for some families who may have been been forced to leave where they're living and so on. But I think by and large, persons have been able to at least put food on the table, maintain some level of normalcy in terms of how they exist with some of these grants. And I've spoken to a number of people who are small business owners, and based on the nature of the type of business that they had open, they were not able to function. But as of last week, was still in operation because of the assistance received for assistance with rent and so on. So I think that based on some of the personal stories I've heard, yes, there has been some positive outcomes. And from a macroeconomic perspective, we still see that the retail sector, um, after a slow start, we have corporations, some companies in the retail sector still posting profits and significant increases. So people are still spending. They're still able to spend based on some of what they've received. So it has not come to a screeching halt. There is demand. Of course, we have the issue of supply chain disruption. But of course, the demand is reflective of people still being able to go out and purchase what they need.
But we've had a significant loss of GDP, though.
Yes.
The Standard and Poor's used a figure of 8.7, I think, percent loss. But there have been economic assessments which suggest that it might be almost twice that over the last 6 or 7 years or so. In terms of loss of GDP. What does that mean for us in terms of trying to have growth, recovery, catch up? Because we have not had anything but decline since 2016. COVID has exacerbated that. And we have a very steep climb back up period before us and many, many problems to solve. And in a fundamental way, the question is, where do you start? Or how do you sequence what you do?
Well, what happened really, what is happening, what we're seeing in the economy now is as a result of what was happening pre-COVID, way before COVID. Oil production declined almost 40%. We had a significant decline in energy revenues. Then we had the crash in terms of the oil prices significantly declining. There's a lot of volatility where the oil prices are concerned. So we've been seeing a general decline in that output and the energy sector's contribution to our GDP. So that is no secret there. We really have been observing that for quite a while before COVID. COVID simply exacerbated on and what was already in progress in terms of the decline in GDP. Now, not everyone will agree with this, but from an economic standpoint, sometimes you really have to spend your way out of a crisis. And I spent some time, out of, there's always a silver lining in the cloud. I was able to read in detail the roadmap to recovery. I was able to read in detail some of the spatial development policy proposals and so on. And on that roadmap to recovery, there's some things that we can do that can jumpstart really quickly. And one of them I noted was that there's some low hanging fruit there. And one of them was that there were substantial liabilities that were due to industries, and there was a substantial amount of debt owed to. I think the report on the roadmap to recovery actually highlighted substantial tranches of debt to contractors. So by virtue of honoring some of the debt and the liabilities that was incurred over time, would be a way to ensure that these companies will, or these contractors will now be able to have that cash injection, and their cash flow won't be as significantly compromised as it would have been, and they would have been out of operation, and that would enable them to restart a number of the projects that were already in train. So those are some of the things that can be done. In addition to which, during the course of the lockdown, of course, there were a number of things that had to be halted, and understandably so. And I think now that the construction sector has reopened and so on, I would expect that a number of the which is part of the roadmap to recovery as well, and dealing with and part of the spatial development plan that I read is dealing with the sort of upgrades to some of our cultural and heritage facilities and some of our beaches and so on. So I would expect that, some of those things, and that will generate jobs in the mean as well. And so that can kickstart things, and then things can go there. A number of other things that can be done, and I think this is critical, is that what COVID has taught us, if nothing else, is that we can swiftly adapt in terms of technological transformation. Unfortunately, it took COVID-19 to help us understand that we could quickly adapt and transform to a virtual or sort of remote environment, and create a more efficient way of getting business done. So I think that there are some things that can be done swiftly that can restart, almost like give us that jump start that we need, and then things would naturally, the multiplier effect will kick in, and some of these other natural things in terms of economic occurrences would then help us really move forward quickly. I noted also in the roadmap to recovery that the part of the plan was to really encourage the banks, which are highly liquid, to, I mean, remember, we have four of the financial institutions in Trinidad have an asset base which is equivalent to the country's GDP. So there's a lot of liquidity in the system. And so, providing some sort of confidence in the business owners and trying to create that environment, that macroeconomic environment that builds on, restores confidence in what is going on, is going to be critical. So if we begin to get the construction industry moving, get the manufacturing sector moving by creating that enabling environment, get the small and medium enterprises moving by way of making that ease, working on that ease of business, we can really see that there will be some sort of confidence restored in the system when we see things moving forward. But if we're not seeing things moving forward, the average investor will say, you know what, this is not a time for me to go out and start, investing in something when the macroeconomic system doesn't look too promising. But if they see things moving, we work based on how we see things happening. And if we see things moving, then people will be more inclined to say, okay, let me go out there and get working on my idea. So I think there's a lot that can be done in that time frame. Yeah, I'll stop there and see if you wanted to have any follow-up questions, because I do have a few points here that I wanted to address as well.
Well, I'll let you raise as many points as we have time for, but I just want to kind of summarize some of the things that you said to help the viewer or the listener to understand what you are saying that government should do, and it can make a big difference. You are saying pay the debts that you have to contractors and pay VAT and tax refunds to business people to keep them solid, okay?
Right, yes.
Secondly, you are saying we need some public development expenditure that would create some value, but would also create economic activity that would circulate some money and also generate some jobs. So, because right now, for instance, the amount spent on development expenditure in the last fiscal year was 3%, which is really horrible. And so that's the second thing that you are saying. So you pay off some of your debt to the local business players, whether it is VAT, whether it is tax refunds, whether it is debts to the contractors, and you have a public expenditure program that's focused on development, not just make work, on development issues. So you create value, you create opportunity, you circulate some money. Thirdly, you're saying that COVID forced us to intensify our adoption of technology and its applications. And we should intensify that. And
Yes.
we now have a Ministry of Digitalization. I see yesterday the minister responsible was presenting to the cabinet. I wouldn't have any knowledge whatsoever of what he presented or said, but I would think that from your point of view, given what you're saying, that would be an important ministry for actioning some of the things that we need to do. Fourthly,
Yes.
you are saying that we should use the liquidity in the banks. We shouldn't just have the money sitting in the banks. Because if you make that liquidity available as liquidity to operating businesses, what you would do is give them a chance to recover. You would get a chance to boost commerce, but you would also, by supporting businesses, boost confidence in the economy. And that you are saying basically where this money should go is in manufacturing, and it should also go to help the small and medium businesses. And finally,
Yes.
you're saying that we have delayed, I'm putting words in your mouth now, but I know you also think so. We have delayed too long with this ease of business, of doing business matter. We are crippling the business sector and crippling the economy and stymieing investment. Let's get this thing done. So these 5 things you are saying, and they are very positive suggestions. So I'll give you a chance to go on and make some other suggestions.
Following on from that, now by virtue of the digitalization process and the improving efficiencies through the use of technology, we acknowledge the fact that there will be some creative destruction in the process, in that some jobs will no longer be required. Some functions of physical persons and their man hours may not be required, by virtue of the technology being able to facilitate a more efficient process. So what we really need to consider is the education sector would now have to step in, and start thinking about what are the development needs in terms of the labor force development plan. Focus on what we would need going forward. Have a sort of an approach where it would be a multifaceted approach. Ministry of Education, in coordination with the Ministry of Planning and Development, would now, and the Ministry of Labor, of course, would now come together and say, okay, this is the workforce development plan, and this is where the areas we need to focus based on the projections that we would need to retool persons so that they would now be able to function in a different capacity, whether it be in improve their technological skills so that they can perform at a higher level in terms of the use of the technology, or whether it be that they need to be, transition to a different sector where the need is great. So, for example, you may transition from the services sector and we get the manufacturing sector going. You can transition to the manufacturing sector but function at higher levels. We also need to focus on the issue of agriculture. Now, I know there has been the discussion of the 500 billion or so, or 500 million. I can't remember. It's 500
Yes,
billion
it
million.
is. It is $500 million that was allocated for agriculture.
Right. But one of the issues that still remains is that while we have that injection, the issue of land tenure for farmers had not been addressed adequately. And so that creates a little, what I would say is a bottleneck. So that while we have that injection of cash and the non-resolution of the issue of land tenure, that cash will just stay there because, people won't want to spend a whole lot of money on a piece of land,
That
on
they don't
farming a land,
own.
and you don't own it. And you
Yes.
don't even have an idea as to when you would get that tenure, issue addressed. So I think land tenure needs to move to the front and give farmers that sense of comfort that, okay, you can now farm this land because the technologies are there. We see the technologies with the aquaponics and so on for resilient farming, resilient agriculture, where you're not growing on the ground, but you're growing above the ground. You're
Yes.
growing in water troughs. and the output is even we had the Tech Agri Expo pre-COVID, and I was amazed to see the technology in farming, and the level of output has been significantly increased. So that land tenure issue needs to be addressed. And in terms of the spatial development plan, and sorry, going backtracking a little bit, you see, when we start thinking about retooling people, there's going to be a cost. But there were some areas where we may not necessarily need persons. So it will call for a close examination of this GATE program. And this GATE program should not just be for the tertiary academics, but this GATE program can be expanded without increasing the allocation, but making it more targeted in terms of our development needs and a workforce development plan. So if it is that we want more persons in nursing, then or not necessarily nursing, we want more persons in TVET programs perhaps to meet some of the needs of persons, because of course for a little while people may not be buying big ticket consumables, the high ticket, big ticket ones like new refrigerators and so on. So maybe some persons maybe want to be trained in those areas. They should be able to have access to free. They have some of the access to the free programs, but they can also have access to other programs that are offered by private sector where they can get coverage for that. I know we have the different national programs that you can get training in those areas in TVET programs, but we can give them options as well. And with GATE being more targeted, then we can also see there may actually be a reduction. I remember at one point in time in the United States, schools, universities were subsidized to not take on any more medical students because the net effect of graduating too many medical students took the salary levels down to ruinous levels, not livable salaries for doctors. And we'll see something similar going on here with this mass production of tertiary education. Not that I'm against it, it's a good initiative, but it needs to be a little bit more focused and aligned with what the development plans are. And finally, which is something that is a big issue, and incidentally, all of these issues, I read this book, Economic Institutions for Resilient Caribbean, produced in 2021 by IDB, and it was edited by Moses Schwartz and Berman, two very prominent economists within IDB at senior levels. And all of these issues, most of these issues were raised. So one of the other major issues is the revenue authority, the establishment of that revenue authority, because we need to have some sort of semi-autonomous agency that is responsible for our tax system. As it is, there are too many leakages within the system, so we're not getting the revenues that we can very well get from taxation. We had the example of Estonia, where they had some sort of structured system, and they were collecting taxes at the rate of 99 point something percent. So there weren't any hemorrhage in the system where tax revenues are concerned. So we can work on that revenue authority, and also the sovereign wealth fund. A little bit of tinkering has to be done there, because in this same article here, we've put our sovereign wealth fund has performed well, but the rules of engagement, there's some ambiguity within the law, and I think that should be addressed. I know they had to move swiftly to address the issue to allow us to take out from COVID expenditures, but there's some ambiguity in the law in terms of the requirements, the formula for making deposits, not necessarily with withdrawals, but some of the withdrawals are at the discretion of the Minister of Finance. But the rules of engagement, and there was discrepancies in the academic literature that highlighted some of these discrepancies within the sovereign wealth fund that needed some tinkering to make it very clear. Although we have performed well with that sovereign wealth fund, because it's I think at its peak we were at 25 or 26% of our GDP in the sovereign wealth fund. So we performed well with that, but we also need to be careful in terms of making sure that that sovereign wealth fund can now be translated into wealth when we withdraw. Understandably, now we withdraw to cover some of the expenses associated with the pandemic. But going forward, the withdrawals should be converted into wealth within the system, whether it be generation of capital, human capital, generation of infrastructure, all of these things, creation of wealth within the system. So not just withdrawing to pay bills. And that has to be carefully done so that we can ensure that it is indeed a long-term venture and something that will take us well into the future, because we know that the projections for oil and gas production, I think oil production, they put it at 6 to 7 years left within the system, and we have mature oil fields, and then gas they put it at 14 years out. So we need to ensure that that heritage and stabilization fund is transferred or translated into wealth creation that can take us moving forward.
All right. Well, you've raised some of the longer term issues there. I just want to, again,
Yes.
for the listeners, for the viewers, you emphasize agriculture and strategies that would lead to sustainable long-term agricultural production driven by technology. You talk about the change of the labor force that we now need to accommodate since we are moving the economy with digitalization in a certain direction. You talk about workforce development and the transformation and targeting of GATE. And you talk about the sovereign wealth funds and the need to rethink the framework within which we operate with that. So basically, you are focusing on long-term things. We come into the end of our discussion because we have the news, but I want to ask you something. You know, we have a problem with the labor force in which the participation is very, very low. And we also have a problem with the economy, which is that you have very little transformation of the economy to absorb the tertiary input from the tertiary output, from the system involving UE, COSTAT, UTT, etc. So that is a particular problem there. So I wonder if you could address that very quickly. Just take a minute to do it. And if you would take a minute after that to try and crystallize for me, if you had to advise the cabinet in retreat in Tobago, what are 2 or 3 key things that they must do when they come out of cabinet and as they begin to approach the October budget? What should they do? So could you address those 2 things very quickly for me?
Okay, on the issue of the absorption of the tertiary output, that is something that is as a result of a lack of aligning the development priorities and outcome and projections with what is required in terms of a workforce. So that is as a net result of that. So what can we do now? What we can attempt to do is, because we have such highly trained individuals in hundreds of disciplines, we have hundreds of trained individuals. What we can actually try to do is use our human capital base to attract service-oriented firms, but that would require creating that environment where they can function safely. But we can attract firms based on the nature of what skills we have to offer. So we can attract some of the Fortune 500 companies in terms of consultant services, in terms of planning, engineering, all of these different areas. And we can also, try our best to see how we can bolster our medical care using some of our graduates, because, to a large extent, we have some challenges there. So we can also use some of them and expand in our new health facilities that have been recently opened to ensure that they're well staffed, and we have people that are not overworked, doctors in particular, and some nurses as well. So those are some of the things that we can do to address that absorption issue, but it will take some groundwork before that can be put in place, because what we will end up doing is educating persons for other economies, which will reap the benefits without having to undergo the expenditure. And in terms of the key issues that I think would be important coming out of that retreat, and I hope we will have discussed them, would be that one, the Revenue Authority. I remain very passionate about that one, and I was really encouraged when I heard about it, and I was hoping it would materialize quickly. And also The policies that are associated with this spatial development plan, there's 20 something policies that were recommended in that proposal for the spatial development plan. Far too often we overlook how we utilize our space can influence our economic activity. And as it is right now, we're not utilizing it in such a way that would generate the optimum economic activity. So that spatial development plan, when I read it, well written, is about implementation now. So I think that to a large extent, some of our deficits are not the generation of the policies, but I think the deficit we have is in the implementation process of some of these recommendations that we have. And some of them are indeed low-hanging fruit.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very, very much for this conversation and for your thoughtful approach to the opportunities that are available in spite of the setbacks that we've had because of COVID. And I want to wish you well and thank you very much for being on the program. So we'll talk again on another occasion, okay?
All right, and thank you,
Dr. Conrad, it's good to talk with you. All right, and thank you, viewers, for viewing and for staying with us. Thank you for listening. MCTV, Multicultural TV, and U97.5, Hot Like Pepper Multicultural Radio. This is Brighter Morning with Bo, and I am Bo Tiwari. We'll move on now to Andrew Chan and the 7 o'clock news.